Hey everyone, this is your intrepid host, Mike GW from Surreal Sports Stories. I'm excited to share some really big news with you all. Starting in 2025, Surreal Sports Stories will officially be on YouTube. That's right, you'll now be able to listen to all your favorite episodes right here on this channel. To celebrate, I'm kicking things off by uploading one of my favorite episodes from the archives, original publication back in May of 2020. And don't worry, over time I'll be backlogging all the past episodes here so you can relive all the twists, turns, and sports mysteries we've covered. There will be a couple of audio cleanups here and there, especially as I'm trying to realign the new episodes and the old episodes to all be cohesive, but don't worry, at the end of the day, you can still listen to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. So make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon, and stay tuned for even more Surreal Sports Stories. Thanks for your support, and let's get back to the past with Catfished. It's January 2013. Winter break has ended, and the campus of the University of Notre Dame is showing signs of life at the start of the spring semester. Well, not that much life. For starters, Notre Dame is in northern Indiana, sitting right on the lip of Lake Michigan. When winter rolls around, it's the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. It engenders apathy the likes of which can't be matched. Well, roughly a week before, Notre Dame has given something even more depressing to mull over than a bad Indiana winter for the student body. Their football team just got stomped flatter than the snow under students' boots as they walk from class to class. You might have heard of the University of Notre Dame's football team. University of Rudy fame, historical powerhouse in the 20th century, and constant producer of fairy tales. And this season seemed like it would be one of the brightest fairy tales to boot. At the start of the 2012 season, Notre Dame was unranked and had the toughest schedule in America. But to the shock of everyone, the Fighting Irish ripped off an undefeated regular season and made their way to the national championship game. Watch out, world. Here come the Irish. Well, the University of Alabama had different plans. In what might have been the most lopsided football game in history, I may be exaggerating, Alabama steamrolled Notre Dame 42-14. Honestly, it was over in the first quarter, when Crimson Tide running back Eddie Lacy realized that no one on Notre Dame's defense knew how to tackle him or his teammate T.Y. Yeldon. Both men would finish the evening with over 100 yards rushing. Alabama proved the Cinderella story of Notre Dame was just that, a story, and the Fighting Irish slunk off to their miserably cold neck of the woods to lick their wounds and hope that everyone would forget about how badly they'd been outclassed. Realistically, this was the only possible outcome. Alabama was and is the most dominant program in the country, and Notre Dame had basically finessed their way to the championship game, and they simply didn't have the talent or aggression to compete with the Crimson Tide. And yet, despite this, there was a distressingly high number of people who thought that Notre Dame could actually pull off the upset, myself included. But soon, the story of the embarrassment against Alabama would be overshadowed by an embarrassment unlike anything anyone in Notre Dame and anywhere else had ever seen before. I'm Mike GW, and you're listening to Surreal Sports Stories. To understand the story I'm about to tell you, you need to understand the myth of Notre Dame football. With the possible exception of Disney, no institution is better at crafting a fairy tale narrative than Notre Dame. Now, part of that is just simple luck. In the 20th century, most televisions in the country had very few channels, and Notre Dame football happened to be on one of those channels. They still have an exclusive distribution with NBC since then. Part of it was very good PR. Take this line that sports writer Grantland Rice came up with way back in 1924 in the aftermath of a Notre Dame victory against Army. Quote, "Outlined against a blue-gray October sky, the four horsemen rode again. In dramatic lore they were known as famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. These are only aliases. Their real names are Sturldryer, Miller, Crowley, and Leyden. They formed the crest of the South Bend Cyclone, before which another Fighting Army team was swept over the precipice of the Polo Grounds this afternoon." End quote. Pretty dramatic stuff, isn't it? Rice was the most famous sports writer of his day, and with that simple paragraph, he launched the legend of Notre Dame, as well as the era of hyperbole in sports journalism, but that's another story. Which leads us to the third part of the myth of Notre Dame, the fact that, for ages, they were a damn good football team. Led by the mythical Knute Rockne, the early 20th century was all Notre Dame. Since their formation in 1887, the Fighting Irish have won 11 national championships, compiled 908 wins, 6th most in college football history, had 7 players named the Heisman Trophy winner, and sent hundreds of players to the NFL. Sorry, I sound a little self-indulgent, don't I? Well, even that should show you the power of Notre Dame's myth-making abilities. It's just so easy to get sucked into the story, even if it isn't quite true. Even if that famed Grantland-Rice line was about a 13-7 victory over Army, which wasn't even Notre Dame's most impressive win that year. Even if Notre Dame hasn't won anything of note since their national championship in 1988. To many, it felt like Notre Dame was just living off of the glories of years past. Well, 2012, Notre Dame had a new round of myth-making. They were ripping off exciting victories, and they were anchored by a defense that was captained by the senior linebacker and sure to be NFL-bound, Manti Te'o. Now, Te'o was the golden boy. Born in Oahu, Hawaii, and raised in a devout Mormon family, Te'o grew up like many Hawaiian kids who played football. Really, really good at the game, and almost assuredly going to either USC for proximity to home or BYU due to the school's Mormon faith tradition. Except in 2009, on National Signing Day, he stunned everyone by going to Notre Dame. The move paid off, though, and he would lead the team in tackles his sophomore and junior year, and in choosing to return for his senior year of college, Manti Te'o was so good that he was named one of the finalists for the Heisman Trophy, an award annually given to the best college football player in the world. Te'o was a hell of a story. He was a devout, clean-cut Mormon boy from Hawaii, and in addition to his football ability, his story in his senior year featured a double whammy of tragedy. In September of that year, Te'o's grandmother, Annette Santiago, passed away, and then less than 6 hours later, Te'o learned of the death of his girlfriend, Lennay Kekua, from leukemia. Kekua had also previously been in a serious car accident earlier that year. 6 days after dealing with this unthinkable double tragedy, Te'o would lead the Irish to an upset victory over the Michigan State Spartans, as he led all players in the game in tackles. After the game, a bewildered reporter asked Te'o how he had managed to overcome such a tragedy. Te'o's response was, in retrospect, killer copy. Quote, "They were with me," Te'o said. "I'm just so happy I had a chance to honor my grandmother and my girlfriend and my family." End quote. Real life started to become fantasy. The very next week, against the Irish's hated rival Michigan, Te'o again starred in an Irish victory by making 8 tackles and snagging 2 interceptions. No easy feat for a middle linebacker. He was asked a rather pertinent question, though, after the game. Why had he chosen to play today, instead of going to Lennay Kekua's funeral in California? Te'o had another made-for-Hollywood response. Now, not only had Kekua made him promise to never miss a game, quote, "All she wanted was some white roses. So I sent her roses and 2 interceptions along with that." End quote. It was a shocking story of personal loss, and the fact that Te'o was able to overcome it by becoming one of the best players in the country while leading his team to glory only made the narrative even more irresistible. More and more of the national media focused on the tragic story of the All-American hero and his doomed love. As Sports Illustrated's Peter Thamel wrote, Te'o would call Kekua as she was in the hospital, and her relatives noted that, quote, "At her lowest points, as she fought to emerge from a coma, her breathing rate would increase at the sound of Te'o's voice." End quote. The South Bend Tribune, Notre Dame's local newspaper, published a similarly flowery account, this time focusing on the time that Te'o and Kekua first met after a tough 2009 Irish loss against Stanford. Quote, "Their stares got pleasantly tangled. Then Manti Te'o extended his hand to the stranger with a warm smile and soulful eyes." End quote. If this all sounds like overly sentimental glurge, you can rest assured knowing that everyone was doing it. Well, not everyone. Overly melodramatic, fawning praise of an athletic figure, team, or sport was exactly the type of thing that made the folks at Deadspin.com want to gag. Founded in 2005, Deadspin.com was described by some as the hockey goon of the sports media world. They were also accused of being little more than a sports equivalent of TMZ. Now, there was some truth to that charge. Deadspin had been the ones that, in 2010, broke the story that Brett Favre, the legendary NFL quarterback, had engaged in alleged sexual misconduct towards a sideline reporter for the team he was playing for. In addition, the traditional media looked down on sites like Deadspin for practicing what is called checkbook journalism, which is the practice of paying for exclusive rights to a news story. For context, legacy media news organizations such as the Washington Post explicitly state that they do not pay for tips on stories. The dislike cut both ways. Deadspin despised the traditional sports journalism model as being corrupt, lazy, and slavish. In essence, Deadspin was equal parts muckraker in investigating stories no one else would, equal parts tabloid, publishing stories no mainstream media would touch, and equal parts Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, convinced that the mainstream was nothing but a bunch of phonies. Thus, this story truly could have only been broken and told by Deadspin. On January 11, 2013, 4 days after Notre Dame's humiliating loss to Alabama, an anonymous tip landed in the inbox of Jack Dickey, a 23-year-old reporter for Deadspin, who was also halfway through his senior year at Columbia University. The tipster claimed to be from Lennay, Hawaii, and the content of their email was explosive. Quote, "I know you guys get thousands of tips that are out there or crazy. This is one that should really be looked into. While Manti Te'o is a loved native son here in Hawaii, he is also a fraud. The story about his girlfriend dying is completely made up." End quote. Within an hour of fielding the tip, Dickey managed to get approval to be the one to investigate the story. His editor assigned him as a partner Timothy Burke, a 34-year-old who'd previously been a PhD candidate in the field of critical media theory, but was now an established member of Deadspin's team. Dickey and Burke immediately began digging, like all good reporters should. First, Burke did the obvious. He plugged Lennay Kekua into every search engine imaginable. There were no results, except for various news stories about Manti Te'o and his dead girlfriend. While sifting through the morass, Burke noticed a trend. None of the stories ever perfectly lined up. For example, there was no consistency to the date of her funeral, there was little consistency to the details of her life and meeting with Manti, and she left no digital footprint outside of the context of Manti Te'o's stories. The only proof that Kekua existed was a thumbnail photo of her that appeared in every news story about her. There were more problems. Further investigation revealed that there was no Social Security Administration record of her death. There was no obituary or funeral announcement. Not even a mention in the Stanford student newspaper, which is where Kekua purportedly went to school. There was no record of a Lennay Kekua existing in the Stanford registrar's office. There wasn't even a birth record. For all intents and purposes, the only proof that Lennay Kekua ever existed was as an extension of Manti Te'o. She didn't seem to be, well, real. I can't speculate for sure the exact moment that Timothy Burke and Jack Dickey realized they were sitting on a bombshell story, but I do hope that they were sitting down when they realized it. It brings to mind one of my favorite movies, Shattered Glass, a low-key film detailing the rise and fall of former journalist Stephen Glass, who was fired from the New Republic magazine after it was discovered he had fabricated over 20 of the stories he wrote for the paper. The parallel runs deeper. In the movie, and in real life, Glass's lies were exposed by Forbes Online, a digital publication who was taking on a longtime stalwart of traditional media in the New Republic. Now, once again, the pattern seemed to be repeating itself. Traditional media hadn't vetted the story, and an online site that didn't have the greatest of reputations had done a cursory background check and discovered that the source of their investigation was, possibly, almost unbelievably, not real. But wait, there's more. The tipster had alleged that not only was Lennay Kekua an illusion, but that Manti Te'o had been tricked by a man who was pretending to be her. Not only that, the tipster claimed, quote, once Manti found out he had been tricked, he made up the story that she died in order to ensure that no one asked questions and he never looked foolish, end quote. So, exercising their journalistic bona fides, Burke and Dickey dug even further. If they could just find out who was the source of those mysterious thumbnail photos supposedly of Lennay Kekua, then they'd find the source of it all. Using a series of related images searches and data caches, Burke and Dickey managed to track down a woman, who they named Reba to protect her identity, whose profile matched that of the supposed Lennay Kekua. The photo that everyone saw was of her. Except Reba had never met Manti Te'o before in her life, and she'd never posted those photos of herself online. Instead, she told them that she'd given the photo to an old high school classmate who'd sent her a bizarre request. The classmate had had a cousin in a severe car accident, and said cousin was feeling down about the way the accident had made her feel. Would Reba take a picture of herself holding a sign of support for the cousin and then text it to him? The classmate claimed that he'd asked others to do so too, so it wasn't that weird. It was a strange request, but ultimately, Reba took a photo of herself and sent it to her old classmate. Of course, when the photo started showing up on Lennay Kekua's Twitter profile, she called the guy to whom she'd given the photo, wondering what was up. As she told Burke and Dickey, her high school classmate began immediately acting weird and told her not to worry about it. Shortly after the call, the picture of Reba was removed from the Twitter profile of Lennay Kekua. So who was this strange former high school classmate that had tricked Reba into handing over her photo, from it fabricated a woman out of thin air, and then had possibly bamboozled a Heisman candidate? As Burke and Dickey found out, he was a man by the name of Rehashing Tuiasosopo. But wait, there's still more. The two discovered that there was clear evidence online that Tuiasosopo and Te'o knew each other. The Deadspin reporters tracked down friends and relatives of Tuiasosopo who claimed that not only were they sure that Rehashing was the man behind Kekua, but also that Te'o wasn't even the first person that he'd fooled with the Kekua identity. Two sources claimed it was merely a bad prank that had grown because Manti had become a national celebrity. By now, Burke and Dickey had all of the evidence they needed. Lennay Kekua wasn't real. Everyone had been duped. This was a shocking, damaging story. Its mere publication would have ripple effects across the sports world. First, it would absolutely ruin Manti Te'o's reputation. Second, it would embarrass Notre Dame, the sports media, and make everyone involved a laughingstock for having fallen for the story. And third, once it was out there was no telling what the final fallout would be. So naturally, Deadspin published it. And all hell would break loose. On January 16, 2013, 5 days after Jack Dickey first fielded that tip, and 9 days after the national championship loss, Deadspin published a story to the front page of their website with the following headline: Blarney, Manti Te'o's dead girlfriend, the most heartbreaking and inspirational story of the college football season, is a hoax. The story went off like a depth charge, not only because of its shocking content, but also on account of the national media making a typical mistake that Deadspin was known to complain about them doing. In the Deadspin article, there was a passage that reads like this, quote, a friend of Rehashing Tuiasosopo told us he was 80% sure that Manti Te'o was in on it, and that the two perpetrated Lennay Kekua's death with publicity in mind, end quote. That right there is a singular passage from a comprehensive story with numerous quotes and sources, and with context, it is clear that this specific source was speculative in nature, and that the authors treated it as such. But here's how ESPN, the worldwide leader in sports' on-air news ticker shrunk down the entire story. Quote, Deadspin, 80% chance Te'o involved in hoax, end quote. No sense of context, no sense of nuance, just a sensationalized headline. Maybe it's no surprise that previous bad journalism during the days that Kekua was quote-unquote alive would beget further bad journalism now that she was proven to never exist. and oh, how the sports world began to howl. Impossibly, my dear listeners, it's here where the story gets weird. Shortly after Deadspin's story broke and ESPN sensationalized it further, Notre Dame and Teo acknowledged the whole affair. But according to an article published in Vanity Fair, both the Teo family and Notre Dame knew something was coming well before Deadspin published. As Teo's father Brian tells it, Manti had returned home on Christmas Day 2012 and delivered what I can only describe as the kind of present you don't want to get. Not only was Lennay Kekua not actually dead, she'd apparently just called Manti to tell him that she'd faked her demise in order to escape drug dealers who had a score to settle with her. But it was here that Teo admitted to his, understandably very confused, parents that he suspected that perhaps this girlfriend wasn't actually real. Or maybe she did exist, but he wasn't sure. Truthfully, nothing made sense to him anymore. Maybe he'd been tricked, or maybe he was trying to cover for himself. No matter what, his family knew that they had to get ahead of this story. They informed Notre Dame, as well as Tom Condon, a football agent that Manti planned to sign with right after the national championship game, that all of this was coming down. Condon told them he would work with his legal and PR departments, coordinate with Notre Dame to come out with a statement, and then see where it all went. If you're keeping track, all of this was happening before Jack Dickey received a tip in the mail about an illusory girlfriend. And it all went down before Notre Dame played the national championship game against Alabama. In retrospect, perhaps this might offer an explanation why Manti Teo, the Heisman hopeful, and his vaunted defense looked like amateurs in comparison to Alabama. Clearly, something else was on his and their mind. On the same day the Deadspin story broke, Notre Dame's athletic director of the time, Jack Swarbrick, came out later that afternoon and presented Notre Dame's, and by extension Manti Teo's, version of events. But instead of making things clearer, Swarbrick's statement just made the story weirder. He claimed that Teo was a victim of a complicated catfishing scam. The speed with which Notre Dame responded to the story suggests that they were probably just waiting for the story to come out so they could say this. Now, anyone with a cursory understanding of PR knows that the trick is making sure that your story is the most recent one that people hear, so credit to waiting and then responding. But still, catfishing? What does this all have to do with fishing? Well, not exactly. Though it technically has origins dating back to the 18th century, catfishing is a thoroughly 21st century term, the way Googling has become a verb. The term was popularized by a 2010 documentary called Catfish, chronicling the filmmaker's budding relationship with a woman online, only to discover that she isn't real. These days, catfishing is the act of using online trickery to pretend that you're someone you aren't through the use of a fake online account. It brings to mind the old saying, on the internet nobody knows that you're a dog. Swarbrick remarked that this type of hoax was, quote, perpetrated with shocking frequency. For me, shocking is an older guy who's not as versed in the online world, end quote. But even in this admission, there were questions. According to Swarbrick, Teo had been told of the hoax on December 6th. He told his family on Christmas Day, and then Notre Dame on December 26th. But if that's the truth, then how come, as Vanity Fair's Ned Zeman noted, Teo told reporters on December 8th, quote, I lost both my grandparents and my girlfriend to cancer, end quote. Was it simple shell shock after having your world turned upside down? Or was it, as Zeman wondered, cynical manipulation? After all, December 8th was the night of the Heisman Trophy ceremony, when the winner was announced. Was Teo trying to further the lie for his own benefit? Now, for the sake of objectivity, Zeman noted that he was a diehard fan of Michigan, one of Notre Dame's key rivals, and thus he was inclined to be annoyed with Notre Dame on principle. So take that interpretation with a grain of salt. On January 18th, 2 days after the story broke, Teo spoke with ESPN's Jeremy Schaap about the entire affair. No cameras were allowed for the interview, and Teo had a public relations consultant by his side. He was adamant that he had been duped, that Lennay Kekua was the work of Ronaya Tuiasosopo and two others, but he'd only ever spoken to Ronaya. But he did admit to a degree of lying, saying, quote, I kind of tailored my stories to have people think that, yeah, he met her before she passed away, end quote. Now, if you're skeptical about Teo's honesty, It is worth noting that Burke and Dickey were extremely careful not to implicate Teo as an active participant in the hoax, partly because if they openly libeled Manti Teo, they were looking at the mother of all lawsuits. In a follow-up article published 2 days after their initial blockbuster, they continued to note that Teo's role in the hoax remained, quote, the biggest unanswered question, end quote. Let's just take a moment to process all of this, because there are naturally some serious what the fuck moments all across this story, and there are a boatload of questions. First, what exactly was the extent of Manti and Lennay's relationship? Was it in person or online? In Swarbrick's press conference in January, he stated, quote, this was exclusively an online relationship, end quote. But that conflicts with the early stories that the Teo family told the local press about the star-crossed tale of Manti and Lennay. In a 2012 interview with the South Bend Tribune, Brian Teo, Manti's father, spoke of how Lennay had come to meet Manti in Hawaii multiple times, even remarking that, quote, every once in a while she would travel to Hawaii, and that happened to be the time Manti was home, so he would meet with her there, end quote. Swarbrick stated in his press conference that he would leave it to Manti Teo to explain how his father claimed that he and Lennay had met in person several times. Not exactly a ringing defense of the kid there, eh, Jack? Now, Chuck Todd of NBC, who was live tweeting Jack Swarbrick's press conference, remarked that the 80s answers, quote, made no sense, end quote. It was as if Swarbrick seemed to be putting it all on Teo, as if Teo was singularly fooled by a rogue trickster, and Notre Dame had no inkling of what was to come until they were notified by Teo on December 26th. But that might not have been the case. Some further internet sleuthing done by BuzzFeed News unearthed Twitter conversations between folks who were joking about Lennay Kekua's falsehood in mid-December, after Manti told his family, but before the university claimed it was told. And in an interview with ESPN's Bob Holtzman, one of Manti's teammates remarked that players on the team were generally under the assumption that Lennay Kekua wasn't really Manti's girlfriend. They had all thought they'd only met once, though he played along with this story when the national media started drawing that connection. The teammate, who spoke under condition of anonymity, did not indicate whether Manti was aware of or perpetrated or participated in the hoax. But we're still not solving the question that everyone's asking, which is, why? Why would they do this? What was the purpose of this elaborate ruse? There was one more angle that many in the media pondered, and that concerned whether this was all a cover-up to hide Manti Teo's sexuality. Basically, from the moment it was revealed that Lennay Kekua was actually Ronaya Tuiasosopo, the rumor mill started swirling, and conclusions were drawn. In an interview with Katie Couric, Manti Teo was asked point-blank by the award-winning journalist if he was gay. Teo's response, quote, no, far from it, end quote. It was reported by multiple sources that there was an undertone of nervous laughter both from Teo as well as the audience. The response calls to mind Magic Johnson's post-HIV diagnosis interviews, where he would often assure talk show audiences that he might have HIV, but that he wasn't gay. As if being gay is somehow worse than contracting an at-the-time near-fatal disease. Some wondered if Teo, raised in a doubly conservative environment, his family was Mormon and Polynesian, had gone to these great lengths to hide his own repressed sexuality. In addition, football is not necessarily considered one of the most progressive sports out there, and there remains a heated debate if an openly out player would be accepted in the locker room. Having played football myself, all I can say is I wouldn't give a damn what my teammates' inclinations are so long as they help the team win. Also, who am I to say that I'd even be their type? Now, for what it's worth, most LGBT-centric media took the rumors in stride. Sid Ziegler, the co-founder of Out Sports, an LGBT-focused sports website, dryly noted that, quote, this fantastic story about car accidents and death by leukemia would just be showing off that stereotypical gay flair for the dramatic, end quote. Ziegler noted that if Teo was gay, then he was sure Teo would be accepted by the vast majority of his family, teammates, and fans. But if he wasn't, then Ziegler noted that Teo had better be ready to answer some questions, quote, because people want to know why on earth he would concoct this totally fabricated story, including 8-hour phone calls, if they never happened, end quote. Then, to make things even stranger, Ronaya Tuiasosopo broke his silence. The mastermind behind the trickery would tell his side of the story to Dr. Phil in late January 2013, roughly 2 weeks after things went down. When pressed, Tuiasosopo made it clear that Teo was never a part of the hoax. He also stated that he invented the Lennay Kekua character as a means of expressing his love for Teo. When talking about Kekua, Tuiasosopo spoke of her as a sort of outlet for his own personal expression. Quote, "I pretty much had this escape of Lennay, and this was where my heart had pretty much invested not just time, but all of my energy went into this." End quote. He further went on to say that he grew to feel for Teo in ways that he could not control, and after a heated argument between Teo and Kekua in September of 2011, Tuiasosopo decided to kill off Kekua. Dr. Phil asked Tuiasosopo if he could recreate Kekua's voice. Standing behind a screen, Tuiasosopo produced, as Vanity Fair put it, quote, "a miraculous, if not entirely persuasive, replica of the voice," end quote. Now, Vanity Fair's bitterness in that line may stem from the fact that Tuiasosopo blew off a scheduled interview request and instead decided to tell his tale to Dr. Phil, that bastion of journalistic integrity. So there we have it. This was a fake girlfriend conjured up by someone who had a passing relationship with Manti Teo, who proceeded to develop powerful feelings for Teo, and then created a year-long totally online relationship with him. And Teo, for his part, first spoke of Lennay Kekua and how he'd met her and loved her, and then he claimed that it was an entirely online relationship. Someone is clearly lying here, because none of this makes sense. So what's the resolution here? Well, that's the thing. This story just sort of fizzled away. Manti Teo would go on to play in the NFL, just like everyone expected him to. But the added scrutiny of the Lennay Kekua fiasco stuck with him. That, plus an underwhelming performance at the NFL Combine, basically the job interview before the draft, caused him to fall down the draft boards, sliding out of the top 10 picks in the draft where he was projected to go, into the second round of the draft, nowhere near the prestige and money. He has played since the 2013 season, though is currently a free agent. He's had an unremarkable career by NFL standards, but has still made a lot of money, and that's far better than most who go on to the pros. As for Ronaya Tuiasosopo, he's still apparently in Hawaii, working in his father's ministry. This entire story stays frozen as a truly surreal episode. So if there's no resolution, then what can be taken from it? What's the lesson? Perhaps the root cause of all of this can be traced back to the mistakes of Grantland Rice 100 years ago. Now, Deadspin might have been a tabloidy, muckraking site that traditional media would turn its nose up at, but they were not wrong in pursuing journalistic due diligence. As a reporter, you have to double-check every single story you face, and you can never buy into myth-making, the likes of which Grantland Rice dreamed up in the 1920s because he was trying to make people buy his writing. Even Murray Sperber, author of A History of Notre Dame Football, noted that Rice was the type to just sort of fling stuff to the wall and see what sticks, remarking that the, quote, vast majority of his figures of speech quickly disappeared, end quote. Grantland Rice was a storyteller. He was a fabulist, not necessarily a reporter. Now, was it wrong for Deadspin to publish this story? No, it wasn't. Even if Teo was merely a confused, clueless, sheltered guy, which I personally am inclined to believe, this entire narrative that Notre Dame, the media, and even Teo pushed was based on a lie. And part of the necessity of the free press is for it to report on things that don't always fit into a fantastical, picture-perfect narrative. The truth must always have its day. No one came out of the story looking good. Not Notre Dame, not Manti Teo, not anyone who told the tall tale of Lennay Kekua. In fact, the only people who came out of this looking good were the people at Deadspin. On the backs of this investigative breakthrough, Deadspin, well, they were still the countercultural tabloid of the sports world, but they also began to pump out absolutely impeccable pieces of investigative journalism. They've covered domestic violence in sports, attacked the sexist nature of online harassment towards women, and written countless thoughtful pieces about the relationship of sports and the real world on topics ranging from race, gender equity, politics, and much more. The site has burnished the careers of stellar writers such as Laura Wagner, Drew Margery, Diana Moskovitz, and many, many more. Timothy Burke would go on to become Deadspin's editor-in-chief, and Jack Dickey has published work for Deadspin, Sports Illustrated, and Time magazine. And here's the thing. The story has passed on as nothing more than a strange sort of hiccup from the previous decade. It spawned new cultural awareness of the word catfishing, but that's about it. Manti Te'o went on to have a career. Ronaya Tuiasosopo is apparently still in Hawaii, still working in his father's ministry. Life has rolled on. And yet the story exists all the same. As time rolls on, maybe it'll fade into myth, much like anything Grantland Rice wrote about those old Notre Dame teams of yesteryear. Maybe we'll all forget about it. But no matter what, the story of Manti Te'o and his fake dead girlfriend is an event that is the quintessential definition of a surreal sports story. You've been listening to Surreal Sports Stories. Sources for this episode are anchored by Jack Dickey and Timothy Burke and their, in my opinion, Pulitzer-worthy work researching and investigating the entire story for Deadspin.com. But outside of Deadspin, sources include Vanity Fair, ESPN.com, The New York Times, USAtoday.com, The Atlantic, BuzzFeed.com, The LA Times, Outsports.com, GLAAD.org, and many more. If you like the show, you can find Surreal Sports Stories wherever you listen to your podcasts. Do us a favor and smash that subscribe button and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. It really helps the show grow. You can also find me, your intrepid host, Mike GW, on Blue Sky, at thewritingirishman.bsky.social, and Instagram and Threads, at MikeGWComedy. Again, I'm on Instagram and Threads as at MikeGWComedy, and Blue Sky at thewritingirishman.bsky.social. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. This has been Surreal Sports Stories, you've been amazing, and I've been Mike GW. Stay steady, y'all.